Hello and welcome to episode 22 of the NatalieinRenaissance podcast. Someone recently asked me, as a pianist and as a performer, who influences me the most. And I had to laugh because I have always felt that a musician's sound is sacred, their tone is sacred, and there's some people who play and if you closed your eyes, you knew it was them just based on their sound. And I have always felt that because of this, that sound is so personal. I have never enjoyed listening to recordings, and I have never looked up to anyone, not even the biggest of names, even though I do respect them, because I've always felt that my sound is my sound and my choices are my choices, and I never wanted to be over-influenced in that way, like so-and-so is doing it this way, so I can't do it any other which way. I never wanted to do that to myself. And so in answering this person's question, who influences me, I did mention that I do love the violinist Ray Chen. I saw him in concert, and he is an amazing performer. His music feels so alive, and I love how he captures you and you honestly cannot look away from him. And his music is so beautiful and it is just alive, and it just leaves you speechless because you're just aware of the life that's inside of you. You are aware of life itself, and I think that is a huge feat, and I really do believe that he is such an amazing performer and musician because of that. But in terms of other people who influence me, I have to say that the biggest thing that influences me is life. And I think that music is a reflection of life, especially because of the time element. It has a beginning, it has an end. And the funny thing is that the music doesn't last. And that is what makes it so similar to the human experience. It's what makes it so incredibly special because you can't keep it. Of course, you can record it and put it on YouTube, but it's not the same as having that live performance. You can't make a drawing of it, something tangible. It's going to leave, and there's no way to save it. And I think that is what makes it so special. And so because of this, music is a reflection of life, and music is all about that communion of life, that sharing in the human experience. And it's also to tell stories. And so I think that people who live well make great performers. And it's not like a sense of lifestyle of living well, but people who have this sense of deep awareness, a deep awareness of people's stories from around the world, people who have awareness of their own thoughts and feelings, of their own fears, of their hopes, their dreams, this huge sense of cognitive awareness, and being able to pull that in. And from that awareness, develop these choices, these different physical touches, these approaches, these ideas. It helps to sculpt the music, to create the tones. I always thought about some of my music in color, having a more warm golden tone or having something a little bit more cold and icy. Those things really made a difference to me in pulling out the sound that I wanted from the instrument. But it also came down to the story I was telling and what I wanted to evoke in my audience and what I wanted to connect with. I played a Prokofiev's Sonata in D minor, and I just remember coming up with this story of these very dark places, and I remember channeling all my energy into making those things come alive. And I'll never forget one of the comments that I received after that concert, and it was like, you brought me to like the darkest place I've ever been in my life. And I always do some programming in that when I do take people to this dark place, I always pull them out somewhere else. But I just remember how this person just relayed to me how they really felt afraid and they really felt fearful. And I was like, well, I'm so glad, not that you were afraid or fearful, but I did my job as a performer to really not let you escape from this place that I had specifically created in this Prokofiev sonata. And so I wanted to connect with my audience, and sometimes it is pulling them down to these dark places. Sometimes it is uplifting them to the heights of heaven, but that is the job of the performer, to make that happen, to connect with the audience, to make them feel things, to make them feel alive. And so, because of all these things, I truly don't think that the musical inspiration is just found in the world of music. I think that would be really sad if that were the case. I think, again, music reflects life. And so to be a well-seasoned performer, a well-seasoned musician who has something worth saying, you need to live life and to cultivate that deep awareness. And it could just be being very aware of all the tactile sensations you feel throughout the day. I love textiles, I love fabrics, and just acknowledging that sense of touching wood versus touching stone versus plastic or something furry. Just acknowledging those things and thinking, okay, how would I incorporate that into my sound? How would I incorporate that into a feeling? That is huge food for thought, especially when it comes to a musician developing their tone or their sound. I also love travel. I think travel is just something that I adore because the more that I see of the world, the more I realize how really similar we all are. We're all looking for health, happiness, and also meaning in life. And so the more people that I meet, the more people that I call friends, the more grateful I am. And I realize that although there are differences in expression, we are really in our hearts very, very similar. But so travel, also experiencing new things in the brain, from food to different scents to slow moments of reflection, all of these really build the awareness, and it feels like a foraging moment to me. And kind of asking myself questions really helps me to become a more artistic person. And so having a variety of influences and sources is really important, I believe, in my opinion, for anyone who is a creative or artsy person. And I heard something on a podcast that I was listening to about Serena Williams, and that has always stuck with me. And of course, we know Serena Williams from tennis, the tennis queen. Of course, they did a movie about her and her sister Venus. And so we all know her for tennis, maybe a couple other things. But one thing that I learned about her on this podcast is that she is also very fluently trained in ballet and dance and a couple other things. But it just struck me just so differently because, of course, we all know her as this force of tennis, but in the background, other things that she is doing is building out a diversity of movement, building a repertoire of movement through ballet, through dance that will support her. And I often think that, people who are very strong in what they do, it is because that they're doing all this support that, although it isn't quote unquote a tennis move, right? Maybe some of these things that she is doing for herself physically, it's not quote unquote a tennis move, but that really grounds her and it helps her. And I'm sure in her body, it makes her so much more agile and fluid, and it enhances her tennis game because of all this training. And so as I'm thinking about this diversity in being alive and these awarenesses, it sort of brings me to the idea of divergent versus convergent thinking, and also I thinkers and T thinkers. And so what this boils down to basically is that if you are a specialist in one field, it takes up a lot of your time. You could consider it a niche area, something very specialized, as I would consider perhaps being a musician with an instrument. That is a very specialized world. And so all of someone's knowledge in that world could be seen as someone who is convergent thinker, where everything is very linear. It makes a lot of sense. There are a lot of norms that they learn and implement. And this is sort of in tandem with the I thinkers, where they see things, or they're trained to see things, one very efficient and specific way. And of course, that adds to them being very knowledgeable in their subject area. However, while this can be a good thing, it can also be a very bad thing, because this knowledge that they have accumulated, this experience, it could actually be a very big rut that they have worked themselves into. And if they have no way of being able to escape this way of thinking, it will be a barricade of knowledge that they really have not ever tried to get out of. And so doing any creative thinking is going to be very, very difficult because the mind has been wired to think and work and be a certain way. And if there hasn't been anything opposite to that, that will be very, very strong. And it's almost like talking with someone who is an expert in their field. As soon as you ask them a question that has to do with integration or collaboration, it is very hard for them to see outside of themselves, outside of their own idea, outside of their own training, which means that conversations with them, unless you are there to specifically gain information for them, conversations are not very rewarding, I have to say. And so the opposite of this thinking, or the flip side, I should say, is divergent or T thinkers. And so the main principle of this kind of thinking is the idea of transfer, right? If we think about that I thinker, very knowledgeable, but they don't really have a way of relating to other people, if you put that top T, right? The difference between an I and a T is a line across the top. If you put that line on top, the line that is horizontal, that thinks more laterally, where it's saying, okay, I have this knowledge, but what about this person? How does my area of expertise relate to this? And you start being able to take one step outside of your degree, one step outside of your knowledge, and actually think more divergently, more creatively, more in innovation. And this is where breakthroughs happen from this cross thinking, this divergent thinking, this T model, because you're able to take the best of both worlds and start to integrate them into new thought patterns. And so I find that in looking at life for inspiration, I find myself in these foraging moments where I love other areas because I think, again, everything is connected, nothing is done separately. And so I think to train separately from everything else in specialized programs can be a mistake. I think there has to be a healthy balance of both. But as artists, creatives, we should not be afraid of looking to new fields, new activities, because it's not traditionally done. I think just like Serena Williams with her studies of hip hop dance, ballet, whatever it is, she is really building in herself a repertoire of movement that is only enhancing and only enhanced her tennis game. And so I think as a performer, as a musician, where music reflects life, teaching reflects life, everything is connected, we need to not be afraid to start living these lives and experiencing these moments of foraging in life. And it could be something very, very random. It could be something that you've always had an inkling to, a secret hobby, but try to pull that in and connect it with your area of specialization, because that is where your creativity in the form of divergent thinking is really going to step up. And that is where your brain, your mind is going to have a field day, because it's like, oh, these two things have never really connected before, and it's a new neural pathway. And then you start to see the potential and the possibilities. And that's when our eye knowledge really becomes a lot more valuable, because it becomes an asset rather than an expense and rather than a liability to us. And in doing a lot of reading about this, I have always known and I have always grown up as a multi-dimensional person. My childhood was full of all kinds of activities. My reading is almost on every subject that you can think of, just because I'm constantly exploring these new ideas and reflecting on my eye knowledge that I have, but also really working that T muscle and saying, okay, what could this look like? What does this have to do with my current learning? How can I stretch my current area of expertise? And that is where a lot of the ideas that I act on, that's where these ideas come from. Going back to the idea of divergent thinking and the transfer thinking, I also like to call this constellation thinking, because I think that is how I would describe the way that I think, where I have a really good seed of an idea, but I don't really see how it connects to everything else. So I just kind of leave it, as it were, in the canvas of my mind. And then maybe later I'm like, oh, here's another seed of an idea. So I'll kind of hang it mentally nearby. I don't know how they connect, but I feel that they do. And then perhaps after a while, or it could be a couple years, it just depends on life and a lot of other things, but sometimes I will have these moments of clarity where suddenly, from nowhere, this golden thread comes and it just connects all of the dots for me. And it's not that I've been actively thinking about it. It was more that my subconscious was working between the knowledge that I had, my experience, but also kind of reflecting on the new information coming in. And with my students, I like to call this the crockpot approach, where sometimes not thinking about something is actually the best way to have it become very clear in your subconscious mind. And this is kind of an anomaly, but if the brain is always active, that prefrontal cortex is always working, we won't have those revelations and those points where the mind starts to integrate and assimilate. Those things can only be done in creative rest or relaxation, which is why people who are very, very driven, people who are constantly working, creativity is not invited into their lives because they aren't making the time to rest. They aren't making the time to do these quote unquote recreational activities or hobbies that would actually be such an asset to them. And it's just as valuable as something in their own eye expertise of learning and of knowledge. And so going back to that idea of the performer having many things at their command, having a lot of resources, having a lot of ideas, I think that is what makes a really amazing musician and performer, because you have this wealth of experience, but also this wealth of awareness and this wealth of things inside that you're dying to try on the outside, right? Like if I have a new idea, like I want something that feels like velvet. I want a sound that feels like midnight velvet, that is very musky in its texture. How am I going to make that happen with a section of an opening of a piece? And so thinking about that, I love sensory things. And so those ideas help me a lot more than if you were to describe things in music terminology. But what am I doing? I'm really tuning into the sound. I'm really tuning into the way this feels, the way that my touch changes the sound that the piano is giving back to me. And so this is what makes that crafting experience so fun. And then being able to share that with other people and saying, okay, what did you feel? And sometimes they'll say, oh, well, it felt this way. And it was exactly the idea that you were going for, which makes that whole experience so worth it. But as performers, as musicians, I think, whenever I talk to a colleague, they're like, well, I'm practicing, I'm learning, I'm studying, which is great. I think we do have to devote time and energy into these things. Of course, being a knowledgeable performer always helps in knowing historical performance practices, all these things, but we also need to make it real for ourselves. And we also need to be able to create something where we're able to say, this is my music. And even though this person wrote it, this is how I think it should go based on my experiences, based on the way I see the world, based on the influences and everything that I bring to the table. And I think that is such a magical place to be, where everything is integrating both your eye knowledge, that deep learned knowledge, but also the knowledge that you have about the world from your experiences, from your sensory bank as a human being, your emotional bank, your spiritual bank. All of that is tied together, and then you're able to share that with someone else. And so I would just say, never negate the experiences of actually being alive, of breathing, of feeling the sun on your face, of writing something with your hand and feeling that tactile motion. We are given all these gifts for a reason. And in this time of AI and the technology and perhaps the academic focus on reading and writing, we can't lose sight of our senses, of being alive, of our emotional side, because they're no less worthy than all the other more visible, quote unquote, signs of learning and success. Thank you so much for listening to this episode today. Please like and leave a review. Follow me on Instagram if you're not already at NatalieinRenaissance. We'll see you in the next episode.